So, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this evening's Monday evening exploration. I'm Cheryl Bronstein, Director of Interpretation at the Adirondack Experience. I would like to start this evening's programming by acknowledging that the Adirondack Experience is situated on the Aboriginal territories of the Mohawk and Abenaki communities. Indigenous people continue to live in this region and practice their teachings and lifeways. I'm so pleased to introduce this evening's speaker. Jeff Hall is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Queensborough Community College, CUNY, where he teaches courses in US history, New York history, and environmental history. Dr. Hall grew up near Plattsburgh, where the region fostered not just a love for the outdoors, but also a passion for history. He attended Binghamton for his undergraduate and master's degree and earned his PhD from Stony Brook University. His research investigates the intersection of environmental politics and incarceration in the US in the 19th and 20th centuries. Tonight, he will be discussing his very first book, A Prison in the Woods, Environment and Incarceration in New York's North Country. Please feel free to submit any questions throughout the program using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Hall will answer questions at the end of the program, and museum staff will be monitoring the Q&A in case there are any issues that we can address. Dr. Hall.
Thank you, Cheryl, for the very kind introduction. My name is Jeff Hall, and my pronouns are he, him, and his. I want to thank Cheryl once again and Steph Hampel for including me in this summer's program of Monday evening explorations at the Adirondack Experience and for their assistance in setting up tonight's event. It really is an honor for me to be able to participate in an event sponsored by the Adirondack Experience. I grew up in the North Country, as Cheryl pointed out, and I first visited the Adirondack Experience back when it was known as the Adirondack Museum in the mid-1990s when I was in high school. I have returned many times since and always learned something new and interesting about my home region every time I visit. It is unfortunate that we can't be together in person tonight, but I do hope everyone finds my talk both interesting and informative. I look forward to answering your questions at the end. For the past 16 years, I've been working on the environmental history of incarceration in the US with a special focus on New York's North Country. During that time, I've had many opportunities to share my work and ideas with others. Upon hearing of my interest in this topic, the reactions of people unfamiliar with either me or my work have often contained a mixture of befuddlement, confusion, circumspection, and sometimes a furrowed brow. Nevertheless, for every person I have confused, there have been others, in many cases total strangers, who seem to immediately understand and appreciate the value of my work. One encounter in particular has stuck in my memory. I was taking the Long Island Railroad to Penn Station one day in the early 2010s when an older woman took the seat next to me. We started talking, and in the course of the conversation, I shared with her the topic of my research. What followed was a richly rewarding chat where I felt both seen and heard. As we were leaving the train, this 80-something New Yorker turned, pointed her finger, and instructed me, "You must turn this into a book." Hardly ever one to disobey my elders, I did just that. I'll talk about the book more in a moment. First, though, I want to revisit the folks I told you about earlier, the ones seemingly perplexed by the idea that prisons and the environment could be connected. I get the confusion. After all, for how many people does the word environment conjure images of a prison? By the same token, prisons don't exactly match with the chirping birds, leafy trees, and babbling brooks that, for many, represent the environment. If the apparent intellectual chasm separating prisons and the environment were the only source of confusion, I could easily respond by saying, "You're wrong. Prisons and the environment are connected. Read my book and find out. But the roots of both the confusion and the chasm run deeper. With some exceptions, popular culture in the US has presented an image of prisons as isolated and self-contained environments that exist seemingly outside any fixed geographic boundaries. I'll just give one example. Think of all the episodes of Law and Order, where the police and prosecutors visited Dannemora, the name of Clinton Correctional Facility prominently displayed on the screen. The studio standing in for Clinton could have easily represented any prison anywhere in the country. While but one example, it speaks to one of the central themes of my book. While many Americans may have been conditioned to believe that what goes on inside a prison has no impact on the world outside and vice versa, the history of prisons in New York's North Country shows that that has never been the case. While the ties binding prisons and their environments may be unfamiliar to many people living today, they were crystal clear to the public officials who planned and built them in the Adirondacks. Beginning in the 1840s and continuing into the 1990s, the environment was a pivotal factor in the planning, construction, and operation of prisons in the North Country. We'll start in the Clinton County village of Dannemora, which in the early 1840s was an unnamed, uninhabited spruce forest, home to exactly one human-built structure, a long-abandoned ramshackle hunting cabin. At the time, New York's two existing prisons, Auburn and Sing Sing, were dangerously overcrowded, prompting state officials to begin planning a third. But prisons cost a lot of money to build, operate, and maintain. State leaders thus decided their next prison had to be financially self-sufficient. The environment of central Clinton County proved attractive because of its extensive untapped supplies of iron ore, which state officials surmised could be mined by imprisoned men and sold to private manufacturers and consumers. Profits earned from such sales, New York leaders hoped, would keep the prison solvent, thereby lessening the state's financial burden. The fortunes of Clinton State Prison, opened in 1845, were thus irrevocably linked to the natural world that lay both behind and beyond its walls. However, the environmental transformations unleashed by Clinton's construction were not limited to the mining of iron ore. The decision to build in the middle of a largely undeveloped wilderness meant that everything the prison needed in order to operate had to be built from scratch. To overcome this significant challenge, lawmakers withdrew 20,000 acres of land surrounding the prison from sale, cordoning off local water, timber, and mineral resources for prison use only. Imprisoned men were enlisted to help build the prison itself, using locally cut stone and timber to erect a wall, which you can see in this image, cell blocks, and mining infrastructure. To ensure the health and safety of people living and working in an often harsh and unpredictable climate, incarcerated workers installed amenities in the prison largely unfamiliar to most Americans at the time. Indoor plumbing via a network of pipes connected to a nearby spring, and an unusually sophisticated indoor climate control system. Nevertheless, in a region as sparsely populated and remote as Clinton County, the new prison would never achieve self-sufficiency without modern infrastructure beyond its walls. Many incarcerated men thus found themselves outside the prison, cutting trees for fuel, construction materials, and perhaps most importantly, the building of roads connecting Clinton to nearby communities and rail depots. As the population of both Clinton and the surrounding village of Dannemora grew in the 1850s and 1860s, the prison generated significant environmental ripple effects as local farmers and entrepreneurs cleared new planting fields, erected new homes and businesses, and entered into increasingly lucrative business deals with the prison. Unfortunately, revenues earned from the sale of prison-produced shoes, nails, farm produce, and other goods neither matched nor exceeded the enormous costs incurred from constructing the facility, thus preventing Clinton from ever achieving financial independence. However, the experience of building and operating Clinton during its first 2 decades taught state officials an important lesson, namely that the value of prisons and poorly paid incarcerated workers extended far beyond their ability to incarcerate. Correctional institutions, state leaders learned, could be used to jumpstart far-reaching environmental and economic transformations in their host regions. Armed with such knowledge, lawmakers would have little incentive to reduce the state's increasingly heavy reliance on imprisonment as a form of punishment. Fast forward to the early 1970s. New York was facing an economic death spiral. Industries across the state were shutting down. Rising joblessness exhausted state unemployment and public assistance funds. Those who could fled the state in search of jobs and economic stability in the South and West, taking their increasingly precious tax dollars with them. A diminished tax base meant smaller budgets for schools, parks, hospitals, public transportation, and other services and infrastructure, imperiling the quality of life, health, and safety of all New Yorkers. For those unable to move, the future appeared grim as more and more New Yorkers struggled to meet the basic requirements of everyday survival. As was always the case, the burdens of economic collapse fell heaviest on New York's poor and people of color. Just to survive, many began turning to unlawful activities, and soon the state's urban centers, where most of New York's people of color lived, were gripped by increasing rates of violent and nonviolent crime. Coming on the heels of the post-war civil rights movement, the economic crisis and societal breakdown of the early 1970s prompted a harsh backlash. Appealing to the same racial hysteria that characterized many white reactions to the achievements of the civil rights movement, in 1973, Republican Governor Nelson Rockefeller signed into law a package of amendments to New York's Narcotics Control Act of 1966. The Rockefeller drug laws, as they came to be known, mandated long prison sentences for the possession and or sale of minuscule amounts of a variety of banned narcotics. With many impoverished people of color active participants in New York's narcotics trade, and with all susceptible to police corruption, state lawmakers all but guaranteed the mass imprisonment of Black and brown New Yorkers. The only remaining question before state officials concerned where they would be imprisoned. This question acquired heightened urgency in 1975 as New York's 32 prisons approached full capacity. Efforts to locate new prisons in the New York City suburbs met stiff resistance from residents concerned about property values and public safety. Perhaps unsurprisingly, many of the affluent suburbanites who opposed the placement of prisons in their backyards were also fervent supporters of the very drug laws that made new prisons a necessity in the first place. Increasingly desperate for new cell space, correctional planners looked northward, hoping the Adirondacks could, once again, help alleviate overcrowding in New York's prisons. However, the North Country of the 1970s in no way resembled the sparsely populated wilderness of the 1840s. A region that had long been remote and inaccessible now boasted dozens of communities populated by year-round residents and second homeowners that was also popular with seasonal tourists. In addition, a panoply of environmental laws enacted beginning in the late 19th century meant the unrestricted and unregulated environmental transformations witnessed at Dannemora in the 1840s could not be repeated. Or could they? Time and again, environmental laws and regulatory agencies many assumed were guardians of public and environmental health proved unable to stop potentially hazardous prison construction projects from reaching fruition. Consider the case of Raybrook, a small hamlet in Essex County, 6 miles west of Lake Placid. To alleviate overcrowding in the state's other prisons, in September 1976, Governor Hugh Carey unilaterally converted Raybrook's former state-run tuberculosis hospital, which you can see in this image, as a minimum security prison. The governor took this action without waiting for a legally mandated environmental review of the project by the Adirondack Park Agency, the APA. The APA, founded in 1971, is empowered to regulate building projects in the interests of environmental and public health on public and privately owned lands inside the Adirondack Park. Though its power to oversee projects on state-owned properties like Raybrook's former TB hospital were limited to what was known as non-binding advisory review, meaning the prison could open regardless of the park agency's findings, this episode demonstrated a significant weakness built into one of the state's most important environmental laws, namely that the state government could effectively sidestep environmental regulation when building on its own land. While the state's conversion of the Raybrook complex to a prison ultimately posed little harm to the surrounding environment, the same could not be said for the federal prison that opened directly across the road. Governor Carey's conversion of Raybrook's former TB hospital was the culmination of a months-long struggle for control of the massive 540-acre residential institution. In addition to the State Department of Correctional Services, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and the Lake Placid Olympic Organizing Committee had also expressed interest in the property. The facility's abrupt conversion as a state prison left unresolved the housing dilemmas facing the Bureau of Prisons, which was struggling to build new cells for an increasing population of men in federal custody, and Lake Placid's Olympic organizers, who needed a single location in which to house more than 1,000 athletes and coaches expected to participate in the 1980 Olympic Winter Games. With an assist from local Republican Congressman Robert McEwen, the Bureau of Prisons and Lake Placid Olympic Organizing Committee hatched a plan to build a brand new facility on an undeveloped piece of land across the road from the state prison in Raybrook. This new complex would solve both bureaucracies' problems by serving first as Olympic housing and later as a federal medium security prison. Unfortunately, no one seemed to know who owned the 155-acre property chosen for construction. Maps held by different state agencies told different stories. Some said it was privately owned, while others claimed it was state property. To clear up the confusion, the APA exercised another of its powers and reclassified the tract as state land. This move, however, exposed the project to a potentially long, drawn out, and legally binding environmental review by the State Department of Environmental Conservation, the DEC, something neither the Bureau of Prisons nor the Lake Placid Olympic Organizing Committee wanted. Once again, the APA intervened, arguing for a federal takeover of the property. It was going to become a federal prison after all. That would eliminate the possibility of any state environmental review now or in the future. The tract's May 1977 transfer from state to federal ownership for $1 all but sealed its environmental fate. Given a free hand to do as they pleased, federal contractors began tearing down 75 acres of Raybrook's forest in June of 1977. After feeding the cut timber into wood chippers, they proceeded to flatten the deforested terrain through widespread excavation, which this image clearly shows. Heavy rains in August and September 1977 washed hundreds of tons of unsecured wood chips and mud into nearby bodies of water, harming wildlife populations, damaging critical habitat, and befouling local fresh water supplies. Nearby residents vociferously objected to the seemingly unrestricted environmental destruction occurring in their community, but with the property under federal control, there was nobody to turn to. Even the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, claimed it had no jurisdiction over a project being built on federal land, arguing that as the future facility's first users, Lake Placid's Olympic organizers were responsible for cleaning up the damage. The environmental destruction was only remediated when the federal government threatened to withhold workers' pay and funding necessary to complete the project in time for the 13th Winter Games in February 1980. Just another photo of the completed project shortly before the Olympics in 1980. The opening of 2 prisons in Raybrook outside established environmental legal frameworks underscored the degree to which prisons posed risks to the North Country environment as great as those unleashed at Dannemora in the 1840s, when the very idea of environmental law was but a fantasy. The experience of Raybrook also taught state leaders a very important lesson, namely that environmental regulations were no barrier to opening prisons inside the Adirondack Park. This was a particularly valuable lesson, as the need for new prisons did not abate with Raybrook, as the ever-increasing state prison population only deepened Albany's interest in building prisons in the North Country throughout the 1980s and 1990s. However, the experience of Raybrook also taught residents and homeowners an important lesson, namely that preventing potentially grave prison-induced harm to environmental and public health would require grassroots resistance. Unfortunately, arguments against building prisons, especially those put forward by tourists and second homeowners, often reflected opponents' class and racial biases. This proved especially true in the Franklin County hamlet of Gabriels, after the state proposed converting another old tuberculosis hospital as a minimum security prison in the summer of 1981. Homeowners in the Gabriels area, most of them seasonal residents, quickly organized a group known as Citizens Against More Prisons in the Adirondacks to oppose the prison. In letters sent to the APA, op-ed pieces published in local newspapers, and testimony delivered at APA hearings, many argued that prisons were incompatible with the Adirondacks' historical promotion of leisure and outdoor recreation. However, much of this correspondence was also laced with not always thinly veiled racist vitriol directed at imprisoned men whose poverty and Blackness opponents contended disqualified them from inclusion in their mainly white and wealthy wilderness enclave. And this is one of many letters sent in opposition to the prison in Gabriel's that illustrates the point that I just made. Even the state's promise to increase the hamlet's recreational space by adding most of the Gabriel's property to the state forest preserve proved unimpressive to members of CAMPA. For prison opponents, protecting the area's woods and wildlife seemed less important than preserving its historically white and well-to-do demographic profile. Echoes of CAMPA's ultimately unsuccessful campaign to stop the prison in Gabriel's could also be heard in the Franklin County village of Tupper Lake, where for nearly 2 decades, town officials determined to bring a prison to the community squared off against nearby residents, mainly seasonal homeowners, equally determined to prevent such an outcome. In the 1980s and 1990s, members of Tupper Lake Concerned Citizens, the group formed to oppose building a prison in Tupper Lake, deployed racially coded messages designed to stir fear in the local population. In letters sent to the APA, op-ed pieces published in local periodicals, and testimony given at public hearings, opponents amplified a commonly held view among racists that most, if not all, imprisoned men of color were carriers of HIV/AIDS, warning that a penitentiary in Tupper Lake could spark a public health crisis far beyond the prison walls. Members of TLCC also predicted that the families of men imprisoned in Tupper Lake might move to the community and disrupt the area's racial and class equilibrium. However, a more diverse local population was not their only concern. Giving voice to another racist stereotype, namely that all urban people of color were unworthy recipients of government-funded public assistance, opponents warned that a larger population of impoverished residents would inevitably lead to higher taxes for the area's white and wealthy homeowners. While TLCC's environmental arguments against the prison, much like those put forth in Gabriel's, were couched in racial and class bias, it was ultimately a previously undisclosed threat to local fresh water supplies that scuttled plans to build a prison in Tupper Lake in 1997. I'm going to end by talking about the racial dynamics that structured the conflicts over building prisons and their place in the North Country environment. From the 1970s through the 1990s, both opponents and supporters of the prisons deployed racially inflected environmental arguments to defend their respective positions. While many who resisted the opening of prisons claimed the Adirondack Park could only be used for leisure and outdoor recreation by white and well-to-do people like themselves, those who favored bringing prisons into the park often asserted that the Adirondacks was the best possible place to incarcerate men led astray by the chaotic forces of city life. However, in many cases, local prison opponents did not bother to couch their racism in environmental terms. While prison critics generally confined their racist sentiments to private correspondence mailed to government officials, prison supporters and their allies have usually taken fewer pains to conceal their true feelings. Anyone who has spent time in the North Country knows this. While the Confederate battle flag and other white supremacist imagery have become ubiquitous across the region since 2016, this is nothing new. I'll relate some personal experiences to illustrate. I grew up in the North Country in the 1980s and 1990s. My father, who is in the top right-hand corner of that image, the second person down, right on the right-hand side. My father worked as an officer for the Department of Correctional Services and retired from Clinton after 25 years of service in 1998. So his career with corrections overlaps with the period that we call mass incarceration. The local prison industry was a big part of my family's life. I remember hearing prison employees, including my late father, casually use racial slurs to describe incarcerated people. I recall hearing folks refer to the buses used to transport incarcerated people to and from local prisons as the African Queen, quote unquote. While working at a local steward shop when I was 17 years old, a regular customer who came in for coffee every morning would, as he was stepping out the door, always tell me that he had to go and, quote, pick up his load of coal, unquote. Only after asking my manager did I discover that this man ran a taxi service ferrying the family members of incarcerated people from the Plattsburgh bus terminal to the prison in Dannemora. Finally, not far from where I attended high school in Saranac, there is a cemetery containing the remains of local men who died fighting in the Civil War. When I was in high school in the mid-1990s, Confederate battle flags began appearing on the dead soldiers' headstones. Though just a few examples, they illustrate an important element of the North Country environment, white racism, that is as powerful a force as any storm that moves through the area. While it is correct that not every correctional employee or person connected to the prison system subscribes to racist ideologies, it is equally true that a good many do hold such views. In a correctional system where most of the employees are white and people of color make up most of the imprisoned population, it is difficult to imagine white racism not conditioning daily operations inside North Country prisons. However, as I said before, this is not a new problem. In the book, I relate an episode from Clinton State Prison in 1856, 165 years ago, where white officers had effectively enslaved the facility's only African-American imprisoned men as unpaid personal servants outside the prison. While such barbarism may be unimaginable today, the racist attitudes of the mid-19th century are alive and well. Without the presence and labor of incarcerated people of color, the North Country, a place seemingly steeped in white racism, could not function. For decades, many men incarcerated in local prisons have been active participants in an outdoor work program run jointly by the Department of Environmental Conservation and Department of Correctional Services. In towns and villages across the North Country, incarcerated men have completed a variety of vital public works and conservation projects. They have assisted with flood control, soil conservation, firefighting, and storm cleanup. They've built hiking trails, ski trails, parks, and campsites. They've refurbished Boy and Girl Scout camps, government offices, schools, churches, and libraries, among other activities. And they have done this work for sometimes as little as $1 per day. I'm just going to advance my slides here. This was an image I found after my father died. This is outside Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora. You see my father's name on that billboard, I guess you can call it, when he retired. This was his reward for his service. And these images, and I apologize for the poor quality of the images, I was unable to secure the negatives or the originals of these photos. These are just two images of incarcerated men who helped build the ice palace for the Saranac Lake Winter Carnival. This is in the late 70s and early 80s. And of course, incarcerated people have been heavily involved in that project for many decades. It is next to impossible to live in or visit the North Country without touching the handiwork of imprisoned men. But for most visitors, seasonal homeowners, and even permanent residents, their labor is invisible. Some may catch a fleeting glimpse of incarcerated men working outdoors from their car window, while others might read about quote unquote inmates fighting a forest fire in a local newspaper without any explanation of how or why they are engaged in such work. In either case, the opportunity for critical inquiry passes as quickly as the car speeds by or the page of the newspaper turns. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the creation of the Adirondack Park Agency, surely an important moment in local history that is receiving the attention it deserves. But this anniversary, like others before it, reinforces a narrative that is exclusionary at best and at worst historically inaccurate. While the efforts of conservationists and preservationists and environmentalists, predominantly white and well-to-do men, to protect the Adirondacks are worthy of recognition, much of the work of building, maintaining, and preserving the North Country environment has historically been left to imprisoned men, and many of them men of color. Knowing that many of these men were incarcerated for non-violent economic offenses, their poorly paid work in the Adirondacks, even if voluntary, looks and feels like exploitation. So while the creation of the APA marked a critical shift in land use planning in the Adirondack Park, incarceration has played a far more pervasive role in shaping and reshaping the Adirondack landscape, and for far longer. If you recall, this historical phenomenon of prison labor in the Adirondacks began in the 1840s. In addition to being the much touted birthplace of American conservation, I think it's important that we reconceive of the Adirondacks as a Black and brown landscape. The commemorative landscape of the North Country is chock full of memorials to conservationists. And you can see here what I mean by anniversaries. These two tablets near Whiteface Mountain in Wilmington commemorating the 50th anniversary of the creation of the Forest Preserve in 1935, and then the centennial of the same event in 1985. There are lots of memorials to military strategists, right? Benedict Arnold near Lake Champlain, and even fictional deep sea monsters get their own markers. But where are the monuments to the young, impoverished Black and brown men caught up in a wave of racial hysteria that dropped them in the mountains and forests of the Adirondacks? Why is this part of local history seemingly not worthy of recognition? Why is it so difficult for so many to talk about? I hope that in time, the environment that incarcerated people made and continue to make in the Adirondacks will be as recognizable to residents and visitors as the region's many lakes, rivers, mountains, and prisons. Thank you very much. Cheryl or Steph, I'm finished speaking.
We've had a lot of questions come in, Jeff, and I actually was hoping that you would be able to take on most of those questions live. They were all questions that we could not actually we couldn't address ourselves. So please feel free. If you've got any trouble accessing them, just let me know.
Should I take a look at the Q&A?
Yeah.
Okay. So I see one here. Did any prison have any connection with the Civil War? Well, certainly I could just say the prison in Dannemora, Clinton State Prison, opened before the Civil War happened. And what I can say about that, because the first chapter of my book looks at the first 20 years of Clinton's existence, resources for two purposes were diverted because of the Civil War, right? So resources that were necessary to continue building the prison were diverted to provide financial support for the state's troops, the militia soldiers who were raised and then sent to fight in battle. And the funds available to a group called the Prison Association of New York, which today is called the Correctional Association of New York. That organization began doing annual inspections of state prisons in the mid 19th century, in 1844, 1845. And their funds dried up when the Civil War started, and they were unable to perform the annual inspections that they had performed previously. So I guess that's how I would answer that question. It's really financial when we think about the Civil War's impacts on Clinton State Prison, which was the only prison in this area at that time. I see Willard on your map. Was it a prison before it became a state hospital? Okay, I'm just, this looks a little, I got to move the screen a little bit here. I'd have to go back. I've got to go back and look at my map here for a second to make sure I know exactly what I'm answering. Sorry for this. So Willard. I don't want to give an answer that's not correct. I can't answer that question. I apologize for that. That's outside my current knowledge base. Sorry for that. Okay, so this question from Diane Milhan. Would you comment on the use of Dannemora Clinton State Hospital as a transfer location for tuberculosis patients who were inmates in Sing Sing when they became sick or when TB progressed? I'm especially interested in 1910 to 1920. I can certainly talk about that in broad terms. So the state absolutely did open a special tuberculosis hospital at Clinton State Prison, designed to both incarcerate and treat men convicted of offenses for this dread disease, tuberculosis. And I would say that this was part of sort of a historical phenomenon that was common in the North Country at that time. Many of you listening to my talk this evening may already know about Saranac Lake's history as a place where people, especially people from cities, traveled to beginning in the late 19th century to recover from tuberculosis, which was one of the #1 causes of death in the US at that time. And so you can actually go and visit well, you can't visit, but you can drive past the state prison in Dannemora today, and the large castle-like structure that's there, visible from the road. It was at one time the tuberculosis hospital that, of course, was designed to serve incarcerated people who were suffering from that disease. And the question contains some facts that I think are probably self-explanatory, that at first this facility was designed to accept incarcerated people who were originally held at Sing Sing. So thank you for the question. Let me see here. Okay. Nancy Germano, I know her. Hi, Nancy. Thank you for the kind words on the talk. So Nancy says she's teaching a course this fall on freedom and movement in the transatlantic world. That sounds like a great class. And we will discuss the interconnected relationship between slavery and freedom. In other words, our understanding of freedom can be derived from unfreedoms, whether traditional or modern slavery, and the legacy of slavery is seen in modern imprisonment. I plan to incorporate environmental concepts into the course. That's really good. I'm wondering if you explored and see connections between slavery, imprisonment, and the environment. Well, I think absolutely. And I think if you want to sort of think about what I talked about during my presentation, the outdoor prison labor that was so vital both to the uh, construction of prisons like Clinton, but also became vital to the communities where prisons were built. I think you can absolutely make those connections, right? As I pointed out, and this has sort of become my cause now, is showing how the prison labor programs that were started at Clinton, at least in this area, and then accelerated in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s at the other prisons that were built in the region, how the labor of primarily people of color, primarily poor people, was essential to keeping the Adirondacks, keeping communities, keeping built environments, unbuilt environments in good working order. And as I pointed out, in many cases, incarcerated workers are paid very little, sometimes $1 a day. They're performing very difficult outdoor manual labor, sometimes out in the hot sun or in the frigid cold. And their work in many cases is taken for granted. There are many people I've talked to since I began this project who grew up here who didn't know about the fact that incarcerated labor played such an important role in public works projects and conservation projects across the region. And so absolutely, I think if you look at the pervasiveness of these projects over the decades, even centuries, look at the different places where these projects were performed, where this work was done, and then consider the exploitation that I mentioned before, the low pay that the individuals made, and the conditions, the political and social conditions that sort of landed them in prison in the first place. I think you can definitely make those connections. They're maybe not perfect, right? Because slavery and imprisonment were, two different legal and sort of political and social systems. But I guess you could say the comparisons I think would be apt for students to think about. So thank you. Do you think that, Anthony Antonucci, thank you for the question. Do you think that privatized prisons will ever be built in the Adirondacks in the future? Very good question. I've actually, in the past, I might have just said, well, no way, right? First of all, the state doesn't allow private prisons. New York State doesn't allow those. And so my automatic answer in the past might have been no. But as we know from the past, year and a half of the pandemic and the attendant uptick in unlawful activity that we've seen in places like New York City, where I lived for 10 years and where I'll be returning at some point, and in other places in the United States. It's quite possible that prisons that have been closed could at some point in the future be needed again. I've had this conversation with several other folks who've asked me about it. And privatized prisons, well, we could see a political shift in the state of New York. We could see, if you're following the news, I'm sure you all are, we could see a very interesting gubernatorial race next year, a very interesting mayoral race shaking up in New York City. And the political winds could shift enough that I would say stay tuned. I wouldn't rule anything in or out. It's an interesting time we're living in because it does bear some connection to social and political problems that we witnessed half a century ago. So a very good question. Thank you. From Brent Glass, were you able to interview formerly incarcerated individuals? I did talk to some formerly incarcerated individuals, none of whom wanted to be quoted in my work, and I respected their choice. And in fact, most of them were individuals who had been imprisoned in Dannemora at what is now called Clinton Correctional Facility. And they had some very interesting and really, I'd say, really reflective and sort of thoughtful comments about their experience uh, in the state prison in this region. And that was really what we talked about, was not so much their experience in the prisons, but their experience in being imprisoned in the Adirondacks. And their comments really ran the gamut. Some told me they really liked being up here. Others hated it. Some were, in the middle. But I would say that everybody who's been incarcerated in this region has an opinion on this region. And that's actually an area of research that's really, I think, a fascinating topic that someone listening to this program would be well worth looking into if I don't look into it myself. So thank you for that. Casey Holler, thank you for the question. What was the decision process that went into organizing the book around different types of sources and case studies? Also, was there anything that ended up on the cutting room floor? There was the cutting room floor wasn't big enough for everything that got cut. So I'll talk. I like talking about the research process. So thank you for that question. So I'll be honest. When I started this project, I knew that there were prisons in this area besides Clinton, but growing up here, living here, I really didn't know anything about their history. I knew they were here. I didn't know how they got where they were built. I didn't really know much about them at all. So I began by sort of scouring local periodicals to sort of establish a narrative. And then I ended up actually doing Freedom of Information Act requests to the Adirondack Park Agency to see what they had on the prisons in the region, because I chased down sources in a lot of different areas where I eventually found out sources did not exist. And so I had to sort of take some detours to finding my sources. And as it turned out, the Adirondack Park Agency had many of the documents that other state agencies had either destroyed or just not saved. And so the chapters in the book, I organized the book as the questioner pointed out, around case studies. So Dannemora, Raybrook, Gabriel's, Lion Mountain, and Tupper Lake were not the only case studies I wanted to write about. I wanted to also have a chapter about Moriah, the shock incarceration facility there. The problem was the park agency didn't have the sources that I needed. The other chapters that I write that are in the book, there were almost too many sources. So just to give you a sense, just to answer the question about the cutting room floor, the second chapter of this book, if any of you read it, was originally cut down from 172 pages. That's how long the chapter was. And I got some very good advice from my professors that could not ever be a book chapter. So lots of stuff ended up on the cutting room floor, for sure. And I think that really, I think anybody who does historical research and writing knows the pain involved with especially cutting out stuff that you think is important and is really good. So Lynn Faruja, thank you. Hope I didn't mispronounce your name. Is it true that they send the most dangerous prisoners from New York City the furthest north? I'd say right now, today, I guess you could say that's partially true. Not always to the Adirondacks, though. Many people who are convicted of violent offenses can end up in prisons that are even closer to New York City in the Hudson Valley, or even in Western New York. But Clinton, for a long time, was the state's largest maximum security prison. So definitely that prison held many people who had been convicted of a variety of violent offenses and still does today. Cindy Kindle, thanks for the question. Can you talk a little bit about the social ramifications of these small communities having a prison as their main employer? A very good question. And I think in each community that's different, right? So especially so for example, like if you were to take a ride through some of these communities today, take a ride through Dannemora, for example, or Gabriel's, or Raybrook, right? I think that these places were always relatively quiet and unassuming. And I think that's generally true to this day. I think that prisons really didn't alter sort of the social picture of these communities in any significant way. I would say, though, that there were ones that I mentioned before. Each community experienced incarceration differently. So if you look at Raybrook, right, I think because the state and federal governments excluded the local population from planning the prisons and from the projects that were involved in building the prisons, I think there was a lot of resentment. I mean, at least that's what the sources showed me. There was a lot of resentment among the local population, especially toward the federal prison, which doubled as the Olympic athletes' village, because of the destruction, because of the public and environmental health threats that the project posed, because they were left out of the planning. They were just ignored. So that, and I relate this in the book, I think that that resentment lingered for a really long time. It was actually responsible for stopping the Federal Bureau of Prisons from building another prison in Raybrook, right? Because the Bureau of Prisons planned to build another federal prison in 1983 and again in 1989. And the local population rose up against those proposals. And each time the proposal was withdrawn. So in Raybrook, I think you see sort of this interesting social experience of incarceration where the local population sort of accepted the state prison. It was built inside a facility that had been there since 1904. It was minimum security and later medium security. It was the institution was familiar to the local people. It provided a source of jobs. In general, the state prison in Raybrook, I think, integrated into the community pretty smoothly. The federal prison, on the other hand, which was just across the road, not so smooth. So that's just one example, and I could go into others, but I see there's several more questions. Thank you for the question. John Anzalone, very good friend and another author of Adirondack history. I would be remiss if I didn't point out John Anzalone's excellent book, Battles of the North Country, which I gave a very close read this summer, and I encourage everyone to pick up an excellent book that looks at recreational development in the Adirondacks in the 20th century. A really great book. What are the advantages and challenges of writing about a topic that you have deep personal connections to? I guess the advantage, that's a very good question. The advantage, I would say, is that I have an interest in the topic. I'm not writing about something that I'm just trying to finish to to keep my job or something along those lines. I actually have a deep and abiding interest in what I'm working on. And I will say that was not always the case. I mean, when I started graduate school, I had no inkling that I was going to work on incarceration as a dissertation topic, and certainly never planned to work on this for my profession as part of my professional career. So in that sense, my interest in the topic, I think, sort of developed over time. And luckily it stuck with me. Obviously, there are challenges involved in researching a topic that's so close to home. And I'd say the biggest challenge comes from the fact that many people that I know, many people even in my own family, people I went to school with growing up, depend heavily on their jobs in corrections for their survival. And I know that there are people who I went to school with who don't talk to me anymore because of the research and the writing that I've done about the prison system, which in some cases is critical, as my presentation demonstrated. And so I'd say the biggest challenge is sort of getting people who are in the system to at least not incarcerated, but people who are invested in the system in terms of employment and their financial reliance on the system, getting people in the system to just think about the correctional system, maybe with a more critical eye, not necessarily saying that these people, should all lose their jobs and be left destitute, but at least be open to thinking about incarceration maybe in a different way than they have before. You see, Cheryl is back.
Yes, unfortunately, I am the keeper of the clock, and I know really great questions. We have recorded those questions that were not able to be answered, and we will work with Jeff to make sure that that we can somehow address those. So this was just such an excellent program. I do want to thank you all very much for joining us this evening, and I very much want to thank Jeff. This was an incredibly important and compelling and engaging presentation, and I think it's one that certainly gives all of us who live in this region a great deal to think about. I do want to let people know about a couple of things that are coming up soon at the museum. Later this month on August 28th, we have the return of our in-person Mohawk and Abenaki art market. Also, next week, our Monday evening exploration will be back in person at the museum. It will be a preview program about our upcoming permanent exhibition, Artists and Inspiration in the Wild, and the program will feature the creative team behind the exhibition planning and design. And this week, we have one more in our free Wednesday evenings at the museum program. All of the details about these programs coming to the museum, also some upcoming Zoom programs are available on our adkx.org website. So thank you again very much, Jeff. Thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. And we hope everybody stays safe wherever you are, and look forward to more discussion on this important topic. So thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.